So we've looked at some of the neuroscience and some of the psychology of adolescents in particular, the students that we teach. We can challenge students to be the best possible versions of themselves through restorative practices. RP is a way of looking at wrongdoing and conflict, relationships and behaviour in schools that is coherent but countercultural. And it's a way of looking at the obligation that wrongdoing and conflict brings and how to deal with it. It has two main attractions for me as an educator. One is it's intentional. We refer to this as explicit practice. When you use RP, you can answer the questions, what are you doing, why are you doing it, and how do you know it works? That's intentionality. It's part of our role as teachers. And alignment is the second attraction. The fact that it's congruent with how we teach in a classroom. Teaching about behaviour is similar to teaching about physics or history or English. The traditional approach to wrongdoing in schools was to ask three questions. What rule was broken, who's responsible, and what do they deserve? And it's borrowed essentially from the criminal justice system, where somebody, a judge or an administrator or a year level coordinator in a school, would decide for those affected that a particular rule was broken, who was responsible, and what they deserved. So the decision making is all in the hands of an external party, not in the hands of those most affected, and certainly not in the hands of those responsible for the wrongdoing. There's very little correspondence between this and how we teach. This is totally contrary to how we would teach a subject. So why would we teach behaviour in this way? The RP approach is very different. It asks what happened, what harm has been done to whom. So the focus is very much on what harm has this caused and exploring that, and what can be done to address the harm. So a restorative process brings all those together who have a stake in the specific incident, conflict or wrongdoing. It recognises who has been affected and it gives them a voice. It explores and acknowledges how they've been affected. And for people who've been affected by wrongdoing, acknowledging that they're not to fault, acknowledging that this shouldn't have happened to them, is a key part of the healing process. And it identifies, the restorative process identifies what needs to happen in order to try and repair the harm, or at least address the harm, and enables the group to work out how to put things as right as possible. So these 5 characteristics, if you like, are the main descriptors of a restorative process. It all revolves around the interaction between developmentally mature adults and developmentally immature young people, the humans becoming humane, and takes great makes great use of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. That by working with the student in the zone of proximal development, we can get them to make executive function decisions. We can encourage them and enable them to make executive function decisions which they wouldn't be able to make on their own today, but we hope they will be able to make on their own tomorrow. Remember, the APA, the American Psychological Association, said that effective classroom management is based on setting and communicating high expectations, providing a high level of student support, and consistently nurturing positive relationships. And that's what RP is about. It's about relationships. And not only our relationships with students, but the relationship between students and the relationships we have with our students' parents and with one another on staff. So it's about all 4 types of relationships in schools. And we can put this on we can put our practice on a two-dimensional field like we have with the others, where the vertical axis is challenge or expectations and the horizontal axis is support for the students meeting these expectations. Obviously, the traditional approach is a punitive approach. That is high on challenge, but low on support, low on the actual scaffolding that would prompt learning to occur. Holding kids to high standards, but not just expecting them to do it, not providing the support and the scaffolding to enable them to do it. Similarly, a permissive approach would be high on support but low on challenge. A permissive approach allows kids to decide what's appropriate. That's not our role. Our role is to be the adult in the room and to have high expectations of our students. I strongly believe that students rise to the expectations of their teachers and adults in most cases. So a permissive or punitive response is not a successful one. Obviously, to not exert challenge and to not offer support is neglectful and borders on a form of abuse. So what we want to do in restorative practices is to work with high challenge, high expectation, as the APA said, high challenge and high levels of support. We want this interaction between the developmentally mature adult and the young person to be challenging, but in an environment of support for that young person to make the step towards the right move. So we can refer to this corner as this corner of what we call the social discipline window as operating in unconditional love, or if you're uncomfortable with that term, you can use the psychological term unconditional positive regard. Basically it says, I don't care what you do or say, I'm going to hold you accountable and I'm going to support you to be the best version of yourself you can be. And we talked there about accountability. Accountability is often constructed as the wrongdoer getting their just deserts. This is a vengeance or retributive style of justice, that the student has to be punished when they do something wrong. Accountability, I think, is much more complex than that. It's genuine accountability involves understanding the consequences of your actions, facing up to what you've done and to whom you've done it, taking responsibility for the results, for the consequences, and helping decide what will make things right or go towards making things right, and then taking steps to repair the damage. Now, even people who say, well, they need to get punished, are looking for this sort of accountability. It's just that a punitive response, punishment, doesn't achieve this accountability in the way that restorative practices achieves it on a regular basis. So which of these do you think indicates more learning has occurred? I got a detention for what I did, or I'm really sorry for what I said in class yesterday. It was disrespectful and I was out of line. It won't happen again. Which one of these two indicates more learning has occurred in the prefrontal cortex of that young person? Which of these indicates more likely self-regulation next time something occurs? Certainly with punishment, you'll get compliance. Compliance is a short-term thing. What we're aiming for is a change in behaviour and attitudes that's long-term. So in restorative practices, we have this two-dimensional field, challenge and support, and we try to work with high challenge and high support. We've already seen in teaching and learning, when we walk into a classroom, we have to have high expectations and we have to scaffold the work. The similarity between these two diagrams is stunning. And yet often we compartmentalise working with behaviour and working with academics. But it's the same approach that we should be taking in both. And the approach is through relationships. The old adage that the kids don't care what you know until they know that you care is summed up in this diagram, that it's only through our high performance relationships that we can challenge kids to excellence in teaching and learning and excellence in behaviour, that we can have those high expectations and yet still have a mechanism for supporting them to get there. It reminds me of Principle 17 from the American Psychological Association, that effective classroom management is based on setting and communicating high expectations, providing a high level of student support, and consistently nurturing positive relationships. You could say that about our work in the classroom, and you could say that about our work in behaviour, and our work in the classroom is work in behaviour. There's no separation. It's also this idea of alignment, the congruent practice between our approach in teaching cognitive things and our approach in teaching the non-cognitive, the motivational. And remember, every interaction we have with a young person changes their brain. And this is a positive way of changing their brain, of challenging the development of the prefrontal cortex, the self-regulatory function, so that students think of others and consequences before or while they're deciding about action. Now, it's a reality, I believe, that most wrongdoing and conflict is emotionally driven, and it's one of the reasons why when you ask kids, why did you do that, they quite often honestly just shrug their shoulders, because they don't cognitively know why they did that silly thing. If they stop and think about it, they probably could come up with an answer like, well, I thought it'd be fun or something like that. But really, it's a limbic system motivational process that's going on. It's an emotional process. Most wrongdoing and conflict is emotionally driven. It's an emotional response to something. And it's also true that most harm caused is emotional harm. The harm that hurts, the harm that sticks, is emotional harm. And that's why we're concerned about bullying and cyberbullying in particular over other forms of wrongdoing in schools, because the emotional harm is long-lived. What restorative practices offers us are processes that we can do with students to metabolize that negative emotion, either the negative emotion that caused the wrongdoing or the negative emotion, the emotional harm that resulted from the wrongdoing. Just like the liver in our body metabolizes the poisons and alcohol and so on that we put into it, restorative processes actually take negative emotions and during the process metabolize them to more positive, solution-oriented emotions. So how do we operate restoratively? Well, it's simple and as complex as this. We have high expectations and insist on high standards of behaviour, but we also provide high levels of support and care for individuals to meet the expectations. So we don't just leave them hanging in a punitive response. We don't ignore them in a neglectful response. We don't just nurture in a permissive response. In a restorative response, a restorative way of working, we have high expectations and high standards. And RP is about maintaining high standards. But at the same time, we recognise that the kids, just in the class, as in the classroom, they need support with a new skill or a new piece of knowledge. They need support in learning how to get along with one another. They need support in learning how to respond appropriately when things don't go right. And RP is about responding with high expectations and high levels of support. Now, this is an American piece of jargon, but it's a really critical one here. I think the key thing about restorative practices is that it focuses first on the harm that's been done and treats incidents primarily as teachable moments, an opportunity that won't come again for a student, a developmentally immature young person, to learn something and to write in their brain through the synapses, to etch synapses for the executive function that we're looking to develop. So we have thousands of teachable moments in a day. And we know that if we let some of those academic teachable moments slide, we'll have to spend a lot of time fixing it up afterwards. It's exactly the same in behaviour. Both the cognitive and the non-cognitive teachable moments occur in the context of a relationship. And a relationship is simply thousands upon thousands of these one-on-one teachable moments. It might be in a classroom, it might be on the sporting field, it might be in the playground, but they're teachable moments which provide an opportunity for us to challenge the student to think of the other, to think of consequences, to think outside their initial emotional response to things. And it's, as Perry says, it's humans becoming humane. Our focus through restorative practices is to make more of these positive interactions so that students learn compassion and empathy and thinking about the other's needs. And they learn those things from us. So the purpose of any restorative process is very simple. It's to have a difficult discussion. When something goes wrong, we need to have a difficult discussion in order to try and repair the harm that's been done. To challenge students' thinking towards the other, in other words, to develop that executive function that we've been talking about, and to encourage the development of values and character. The non-cognitive capacities that we have in all of our mission statements. It's about humans becoming humane, as Perry would say. So what does it look like? Well, there's a number of restorative practices or processes, and in fact any that meet those 5 criteria before, about involving everybody or including everybody that has a stake in the incident and exploring harm and so on. Those 5 principles define anything that is restorative. But if you like, there's a spectrum of restorative action from the everyday through to the special or quite uncommon, if you like, from the very informal through to the very formal processes. And these range from affective statements and affective questions where we talk to kids in terms that, pardon me, in terms that include emotional language. It makes me upset when you do this. And that starts to engage with the limbic system of the young person and draw them out of their focus on themselves. Through restorative inquiries and restorative chat, through mini conferences up to the very formal community conference, which could be convened in response to a serious incident that occurred between students or between students and adults at the school. Now, as you go up towards the formal end, obviously this requires a great deal more planning and structure, but it only occurs much less frequently. The affective statements and questions and the restorative questions at the lower end of the spectrum we can use on a daily basis, and we should use on a daily basis. Remember that the purposes of any restorative process are to repair harm and to challenge students' thinking towards the other. So that's what we're doing whenever we involve ourselves in a restorative approach. Restorative practices is an educative philosophy. It's about educating kids towards right behaviour, self-directed right behaviour. It enables the building, nurturing and repair of healthy relationships in schools, and we've seen that relationships are the language, if you like. Relationships are the technology of our teaching. It gives us a means to respond effectively to incidents of conflict and wrongdoing. It gives us a means of doing things that actually works, that will lead to behavioural change. It helps us to develop authentic community within our classrooms. The connections between students and teachers are real and can be developed using restorative practices. It enables us to help form the whole person. It enables us, in other words, to meet the mission of our school. It enables us to teach. I'd like to conclude with this quote from Todd Whitaker. He says that the best thing about being a teacher is that it matters. The hardest thing is that it matters every day. And I think we've seen why it matters every day, because all of our actions taken together build and form the young people with which we work. So my answer to why would a school adopt restorative practices, why should we as educators be restorative practitioners? Because we're teachers. Thank you.